Imagine a world on the edge of change. It is the year 700 AD across the windswept fjords of Scandinavia. Small communities of farmers, fishermen, and craftsmen live in relative isolation. They till the soil, herd their animals, and cling to survival in a harsh northern land. But within a century, these people, once dismissed as little more than barbarians at the edge of the known world, will burst onto the stage of history. Their sails will darken the horizons, their warriors will storm monasteries and kingdoms, and their merchants will weave a network of trade stretching from the icy North Sea to the glittering markets of Byzantium and Baghdad. This is the story of the rise of the Viking Age, and how ambition, technology, and trade transformed the Norse from scattered tribes into a force that shaped the destiny of Europe. Welcome back to our journey through the history of the Vikings. In this episode, we uncovered the dramatic rise of the Viking Age, tracing the roots of expansion between 700 and 800 AD. From the invention of the longship to the first daring raids on foreign shores, we witnessed the birth of an era defined by exploration, conquest, and relentless ambition. So settle in and join us as we set sail into the stormy beginnings of the Viking Age. The 7th century drew to a close with Scandinavia poised on the brink of transformation. For centuries, the Norse had lived in relative obscurity, their world defined by fjords, forests, and long winters. Life was hard, yet these conditions forged resilience. Communities were small but tightly bound, sustained by farming, hunting, and fishing. Men and women worked side by side to survive. Chieftains held sway, but their power depended on loyalty and reputation, not crowns or written laws. It was a society of oral tradition, of sagas spoken around firelight, of kinship ties that bound people together, and blood feuds that could tear them apart. Yet beneath this seemingly static existence, change was stirring. New tools, new contacts, and new ambitions began to ripple through the north. The Vikings were not born suddenly in 793 at Lindisfarne. Rather, the Viking Age was the product of centuries of evolution. And in the decades between 700 and 800 AD, the forces that would unleash the storm gathered momentum. The most important of these forces was technology. By the early 8th century, the Norse had perfected one of history's most remarkable maritime inventions, the longship. Unlike the clumsy vessels of earlier centuries, the longship was sleek, fast, and versatile. Built from overlapping planks of oak, its hull flexed with the waves, allowing it to endure the open sea. Its shallow draft meant it could skim across coastal waters or slip silently up rivers deep into the heart of foreign lands. Powered by both sail and oar, it could travel vast distances with remarkable speed. The longship was more than just a vessel. It was a weapon, a symbol, and a revolution. It allowed the Norse to break free from the confines of their fjords and archipelagos. For the first time, Scandinavia had the means to project its power across the seas. In the decades to come, this innovation would carry warriors to Britain, Ireland, Francia, and beyond. But in its earliest days, it was also a tool of trade, enabling the Norse to reach markets that had once been inaccessible. And trade, too, was transforming the North. By 700 AD, the Norse world was no longer isolated. To the south, the Frankish kingdoms under the descendants of Clovis, and later the mighty Carolingians, dominated Western Europe. To the east, the Slavs controlled the forests and riverways that stretched into the unknown. To the south and east, the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate represented centers of immense wealth and cultural influence. Though Scandinavia stood at the edge of this world, it was increasingly connected to it. Traders and travelers carried goods, ideas, and rumors into Norse lands. Amber from the Baltic, prized for its beauty, was exchanged for silver and fine cloth. Furs, walrus ivory, and even slaves were traded for weapons, wine, and luxury goods. Markets began to form in places like Hedeby, Rib, and Burka proto-urban settlements that served as hubs of commerce. These towns were small by modern standards, but in the Norse world, they were bustling centers where traders from across Europe might gather. This growing network of trade brought wealth, and with it came ambition. Chieftains who could control trade routes or lead successful voyages grew in power and influence. Wealth meant followers, and followers meant strength. The Norse world was beginning to shift from isolated farms and villages toward a more complex society, one where prestige was measured not only by lineage but by success abroad. Yet another force pushed the Norse outward: population pressure. The lands of Scandinavia were not endless. Farming was difficult, the soil often thin and rocky, the growing season short. As populations grew, younger sons and ambitious men found fewer opportunities at home. To seek fortune and fame, they looked beyond the horizon. The longship and the lure of trade gave them the means. Hunger and ambition gave them the motive. By the mid-8th century, expeditions across the sea became more common. At first, these were peaceful exchanges, traders arriving on foreign shores to barter goods. But the line between trade and raid was thin. A ship full of men carrying axes and swords could as easily plunder as bargain. In time, the temptation proved irresistible. The monasteries of Britain and Ireland presented particularly attractive targets. Isolated along coastlines, often filled with treasures of gold and silver, and defended only by monks and prayers, they were ripe for attack. To the Norse, these strange Christian holy men were outsiders, their gods alien, their riches unguarded. The raids were not yet systematic, but they sent shockwaves across Europe. In 793 AD, the storm finally broke. The monastery at Lindisfarne, off the coast of Northumbria, was attacked by Norse raiders. Chroniclers recorded the horror in vivid terms. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered at the hands of heathen men. To the Christian world, this was the beginning of a nightmare, a scourge from the sea. To the Norse, it was an opportunity. But Lindisfarne was not the beginning. It was the culmination of decades of change. The rise of the Viking Age had been building through the 700s, forged by technology, trade, and ambition. And now, with the sails of the longships unfurled, the Norse would step fully into history. As the 8th century unfolded, the Norse world underwent profound changes that, while gradual to those who lived through them, now stand out clearly in the chronicles of history. Communities that had once been insular began looking outward with newfound boldness. What drove them was not simply greed or violence, but an intricate combination of necessity, opportunity, and ingenuity. The heart of this transformation lay in the growing sophistication of shipbuilding. The longship, perfected in the early 700s, was more than a marvel of wood and iron. It was a reflection of Norse society itself, practical, adaptable, and built for both endurance and speed. Carved from sturdy oak, reinforced with iron rivets, and shaped with the distinctive clinker-built style, where planks overlapped like the scales of a fish, the longship became a living thing. Sailors swore that a ship responded to the touch of its crew, gliding across the sea as if it shared their will. These vessels could cross oceans, yet they were shallow enough to run aground on a sandy beach without the need for harbors. This was revolutionary. Where other European navies required ports, the Vikings could appear almost anywhere, striking like a sudden storm. The sails, dyed red or striped with bold colors, billowed above rows of oarsmen who could drive the ship against wind and tide when needed. In time, the longship would become synonymous with Viking power, feared wherever its dragon-headed prow appeared on the horizon. Yet, the Vikings were not simply raiders in waiting. The first decades of the 8th century show us something subtler: the Norse as traders, artisans, and diplomats. The town of Rib, on the coast of Jutland, offers a striking example. Archaeological finds reveal a bustling marketplace by 710 AD here. Merchants gathered to trade furs, hides, amber, and antlers, resources abundant in Scandinavia, for foreign silver, glass beads, and weapons. Traders from the Frankish kingdoms, and even as far as the Frisian coasts, arrived with goods, news, and tales of distant lands. Rib was more than a marketplace. It was a training ground for generations of Norse who learned the rhythms of commerce, the value of negotiation, and the potential profits of looking beyond the horizon. Alongside Rib, other centers rose in importance. Hedeby, nestled at the base of the Jutland Peninsula, would become one of the most important trading ports of the Viking Age. Hedeby linked the Baltic to the North Sea through the narrow isthmus of Schleswig, allowing merchants to haul their ships overland in a short portage rather than risk the long voyage around Denmark. The settlement grew into a melting pot, where Norse, Slavs, Frisians, and Saxons mingled. Each exchange of goods also meant an exchange of ideas, new weapon designs, foreign coins, exotic cloth, and even whispers of distant empires. Further east, Birka, founded in the mid-8th century on an island in Lake Mälaren, became Sweden's great commercial hub. Here, goods from the interior of Scandinavia met treasures carried up the rivers by Slavic and Baltic traders. The markets of Birka hummed with activity. Arab silver darms, glassware from the Rhineland, silk from the east, and ornaments of bronze and gold circulated alongside hides, furs, and iron from the Norse heartlands. These places were not yet cities in the modern sense, but they were the seeds of urban life in Scandinavia, cosmopolitan crossroads that gave the Norse a taste of the wealth that lay beyond. And wealth was power. A chieftain who returned from Hedeby or Birka with silver and fine goods could display them at home, distributing treasure among his followers, cementing loyalty, and boasting of his influence. These cycles of wealth and prestige drove more men to the seas, to trade if possible, to raid if necessary. Religion, too, played its part. The Norse gods, Odin the Allfather, Thor the Thunderer, Freyr the giver of fertility, were not distant or passive deities. They demanded courage, boldness, and deeds that would echo through saga and song. A man who returned from across the sea laden with silver had pleased Freyr. A warrior who struck down enemies in battle had brought honor to Odin. Dying with a weapon in hand promised a seat in Valhalla, where mead flowed and the chosen would fight and feast until Ragnarok. In such a world, the line between trade and plunder blurred not only in practice but in belief. By 750 Europe was beginning to notice the Norse more often. Their ships appeared not only on the Baltic and the North Sea, but deeper inland, traveling the rivers of modern-day Russia. Scandinavian traders, later called Varangians, navigated the Dnieper and the Volga, reaching the Black Sea and opening channels to Byzantium and the Arab Caliphate. What began as tentative forays grew into established trade routes. Silver coins from the Abbasid Caliphate began to flow north in astonishing quantities, hoarded in Scandinavian soil, silent testimony to the scale of this commerce. But if the Norse were learning from the world, they were also watching carefully for weakness. And in the West, weakness was plentiful. The British Isles, fractured into rival kingdoms, were dotted with monasteries wealthy, isolated, and poorly defended. Francia, though powerful, was often distracted by internal struggles and wars with neighbors. To men raised in a harsh land, the riches of these regions were irresistible. The first recorded raid on the British Isles occurred in 787 AD, when ships landed on the coast of Wessex. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a record of the time, speaks of 3 ships of Northmen who killed the king's reeve. It was a small incident by later standards, but it was a herald of what was to come. These were testing voyages, probing attacks, a foretaste of the storm that loomed on the horizon. For the Norse, these ventures brought not only treasure but renown. The sagas, though written down centuries later, echo with the importance of fame. Wealth could be spent, Silver melted or scattered, but glory endured. To have one's name remembered, sung by skalds, carried across generations. This was the true immortality. The young and ambitious found in raiding an opportunity to carve their names into history. Yet, not all Norse expeditions were marked by violence. Many were peaceful trading ventures, journeys of exploration, or even settlement. Archaeological evidence suggests that Norse craftsmen and traders integrated into foreign markets, bringing their skills in metalwork, woodworking, and textiles. They were not merely destroyers, but also creators and contributors to the wider world. Still, in the European imagination, it was the raids that defined them. And soon, one raid above all would mark the beginning of an age of terror and legend. The attack on Lindisfarne in 793. As the century drew toward its close, the forces of ambition, technology, and trade that had reshaped Scandinavia coalesced into something greater. A new identity was forming, not merely as farmers, not merely as traders, but as Vikings, sea-born adventurers, raiders, and merchants whose world was the ocean and whose destiny was conquest and discovery. The rise of the Viking Age was nearly complete. The sails had been woven, the ships carved, the warriors armed. Europe would soon feel the full weight of their ambition. It was the summer of 793 when the storm finally broke. Off the northeast coast of England lay the holy island of Lindisfarne, known throughout Christendom as a beacon of piety and learning. The monastery there was a sanctuary of prayer, a center of scholarship, and a treasury of sacred relics. Its monks lived in seclusion, devoted to God, believing that their isolation on a windswept island offered protection from the chaos of the wider world. But isolation, in the eyes of the Norse, meant vulnerability. That summer, longships slipped across the North Sea, their dragon prows cutting through the waves. The raiders who disembarked were not diplomats or traders. They were warriors, men who carried axes and spears, shields painted with bold colors, eyes sharp with hunger for wealth and renown. The attack was swift and merciless. Monks who had dedicated their lives to peace found themselves facing steel. The invaders looted the monastery, seizing chalices, crosses, and holy books bound in jeweled covers. What could not be carried off in ships was destroyed. Blood stained the sacred grounds, and fire consumed the rest. For the Christian world, this was a cataclysm. The Northumbrian monk Alcuin of York, advisor to Charlemagne, wrote in horror, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens desecrated God's holy temple, shed the blood of saints around the altar, and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung in the streets." To Alcuin and his contemporaries, it seemed as though divine punishment had descended on Christendom. The attack on Lindisfarne was not merely theft, it was sacrilege. It struck at the heart of the Christian order. To the Norse, however, it was something different. A triumph. Wealth was taken, fame was won, and songs would be sung of the boldness of those who had crossed the sea and humbled the monks of Lindisfarne. For the men who rowed home with treasure in their ships, the raid was proof of possibility. What had once been tentative probes now became a flood. If Lindisfarne could fall, then no coastal settlement was safe. The Lindisfarne raid has long been considered the symbolic beginning of the Viking Age. Yet to understand its impact, we must see it not as an isolated act of savagery, but as the culmination of decades of preparation. The longships had been perfected. The trade routes had been tested. The ambitions of chieftains and the restlessness of young warriors had reached a breaking point. Lindisfarne was the spark that lit a fire already smoldering in Scandinavia. The raid also revealed the asymmetry between Norse raiders and their victims. Monasteries and coastal towns were built for prayer and commerce, not defense. Europe at the time was fractured. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England, Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, and East Anglia competed with one another as much as they guarded against outside threats. Francia, though formidable under Charlemagne, was vast and difficult to defend in its entirety. Ireland, too, was a patchwork of small kingdoms, its monasteries both wealthy and isolated. To Viking eyes, Europe was a treasure chest waiting to be pried open. The raids that followed came swiftly. Monasteries at Jarrow and Iona were attacked within the same decade. Each raid spread fear across Christendom, chroniclers describing heathen men as though they were demons rising from the sea. But the truth was more pragmatic. For the Norse, raiding was an extension of the values they already held dear: courage, resourcefulness, and the pursuit of fame. Back in Scandinavia, news of these ventures spread like wildfire. Young warriors longed to join the expeditions, eager for silver, slaves, and glory. Chieftains realized that raiding was not only profitable, but a way to solidify their power at home. By distributing loot among followers, they bound men to their service, creating the early foundations of the war bands and armies that would later conquer kingdoms. The raids also had another, less obvious effect. They intensified the contact between the Norse and Christian Europe. When the Vikings plundered monasteries, they did not always destroy what they found. Sacred books, relics, and ornaments were carried back across the sea. Though the raiders may not have understood their meaning, these objects brought fragments of Christian culture into Norse lands. Over time, such contact would reshape Scandinavia, though in the 8th century, it was still the axe that spoke louder than the cross. To understand why Lindisfarne caused such shock, one must also consider the cultural gulf between Norse raiders and their victims. To the monks, violence against the house of God was unthinkable, an abomination. To the Norse, the monastery was simply another wealthy settlement, defended only by prayers. They did not yet share the Christian worldview, nor did they regard churches as sacred. What they saw were treasures, unguarded, and opportunity. The raid marked a turning point in the psychology of Europe. The sea, once a barrier, was now a highway for terror. Coastal communities lived in fear of the sudden appearance of dragon-prowed ships. The Christian imagination filled with dread, casting the Vikings not as men but as a scourge sent by God's wrath. This perception would endure for centuries, coloring the way the Norse were remembered. Yet even in this moment of violence, we must remember that the Viking Age was never only about raiding. For every longship that struck Lindisfarne, others carried merchants to Hedeby, Rib, and Birka. For every warrior who swung an axe, another bartered furs or traded walrus ivory. The Norse were complex: destroyers and traders, raiders and settlers. Lindisfarne, however, ensured that in the eyes of Europe, they would forever be remembered first as raiders. By the end of the 8th century, the Viking Age had truly begun. The sails of the Norse were now a constant presence on Europe's seas. The world had changed, and it would never be the same again. The raid on Lindisfarne in 793 AD. Once the barrier of fear was broken, once it was proven that the monasteries and coastal towns of Christendom could be plundered with little resistance, the floodgates opened. In the years that followed, raiding became more frequent, more daring, and more devastating. By the closing years of the 8th century, Viking longships were a familiar sight along the coasts of the British Isles. Monasteries at Jarrow, Iona, and Skye were plundered. Towns were attacked, villages burned, and captives carried away into slavery. No longer could Christian communities think of themselves as protected by the sea. The ocean, once a natural moat, had been turned by the Norse into a pathway of invasion. The raids spread not only in frequency, but in geography. The Norse began probing the coastlines of Ireland, discovering a land rich in monasteries and divided into numerous rival kingdoms. Irish annals record these early encounters with grim regularity. The heathens came, they wrote, and they burned. Yet the Norse saw more than just plunder. They saw opportunity. Islands' river systems allowed them to strike deep inland, and the fractured politics of the island meant that no single king could expel them outright. Elsewhere, the coasts of Francia were also targeted. Charlemagne's empire was vast, his armies formidable, but his attention was spread thin across wars with Saxons, Avars, and Lombards. Viking raiders could strike quickly at the coast and be gone before a Frankish army could respond. The mouths of the Seine and Loire rivers soon felt the bite of Norse axes. But it was not only wealth that drew the Norse outward. These raids revealed to them the weaknesses of their neighbors. They saw lands richer than their own, kingdoms divided by rivalry, and territories ripe for settlement. In time, these lessons would transform the Vikings from raiders into conquerors. For now, however, the raids of the late 8th century remained mostly opportunistic. Ships of 20, 30, or 40 men would set out across the sea, strike quickly, and return home with treasure. These were not yet full-scale invasions, but they were the testing ground for what was to come. Each successful raid encouraged others. Each story of silver and slaves inspired new expeditions. A cycle of ambition and reward took hold, fueling the momentum of the Viking Age. Back in Scandinavia, the impact was profound. Treasure and slaves brought back from the raids enriched local chieftains. Silver was distributed among warriors, strengthening loyalty. Some of this wealth was melted down and fashioned into arm rings, necklaces, and ornaments that proclaimed power. Skalds composed verses celebrating the boldness of raiders, ensuring their names would be remembered. Fame and fortune became intertwined, and the horizon seemed to promise both. The raids also created tension within Norse society. Younger sons, with little inheritance to expect at home, were eager to carve out fortunes abroad. Chieftains who lacked the resources to mount expeditions risked falling behind their rivals. This competition drove more voyages, more raids, more risk-taking. A restless energy gripped Scandinavia, as though the whole society was leaning outward, ready to burst beyond its shores. At the same time, Norse traders continued to expand their reach. Not all who set sail carried swords. Many carried goods, furs, amber, hides, and iron bound for the markets of Hedeby, Rib, and Berka, or carried further south to the Frankish and Slavic lands. Trade and raid were two sides of the same coin. A group of Norsemen might raid one season and trade the next. Some expeditions began as trade missions, but turned to plunder if opportunities arose. Flexibility was the hallmark of the Viking spirit. The blending of raiding and trading also introduced Scandinavia to new cultural influences. Foreign coins, particularly silver dirhams from the Abbasid Caliphate, began pouring into the north via eastern trade routes. These coins, often hoarded in massive quantities, show the scale of Norse involvement in global commerce. At the same time, Christian artifacts, crosses, reliquaries, and illuminated manuscripts found their way back from raids. Though their meaning may have been obscured to the Norse, these objects brought glimpses of a different world, one that would eventually challenge the dominance of the old gods. Yet in the late 8th century, the Norse remained steadfastly pagan. The raids on monasteries were not merely acts of theft, but also of defiance. In attacking the centers of Christian worship, they struck at the heart of a rival belief system. The monks interpreted these attacks as demonic, but to the Norse, they were acts of strength, affirmations of their own gods. Odin, Thor, and Freyr smiled on those who brought home wealth and renown. By the year 800, the Viking Age was firmly underway. The scattered raids of the 790s had shown what was possible. The next century would see these raids grow into invasions, settlements, and kingdoms. But the roots of it all lay in this formative period: the rise of the longship, the lure of trade, the hunger for wealth, and the ambition of restless warriors. The 8th century had transformed the Norse world. No longer were they confined to their fjords and forests. They had tasted the wealth of foreign shores, tested the defenses of their neighbors, and discovered the vast opportunities that lay across the sea. The horizon was no longer a boundary. It was an invitation. The Viking Age had risen, and Europe was only beginning to understand what that meant. By the dawn of the 9th century, the raids of the Vikings were no longer isolated shocks. They had become a pattern, a new reality that Europe was forced to confront. The sudden violence of Lindisfarne in 793 had seemed like a thunderclap, an inexplicable burst of savagery from the north. But as years passed and longships continued to appear along the coasts, it became clear that this was not a passing storm. It was the beginning of a new age. For the Vikings themselves, the lessons of the 790s had been learned well. They understood now not only that Europe was vulnerable, but also how to exploit that vulnerability. Coastal monasteries and villages offered quick prizes, but rivers offered something even greater: access to the interior. The shallow draft of the longship allowed raiders to travel up rivers like the Thames, the Loire, and the Seine, striking at towns that had believed themselves safe inland. This capacity gave the Vikings a freedom of movement that bewildered their enemies. The very psychology of Europe began to shift under the pressure of this threat. Chroniclers of the time wrote in tones of dread. In England, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded each new raid with a sense of resignation, as though the very fabric of society were unraveling under the weight of heathen assaults. In Francia, the Annales Regni Francorum spoke of sudden Viking attacks along the coastlines, describing the terror they inspired and the desperate attempts to defend against them. The fear was not unfounded. The Vikings possessed an uncanny ability to appear suddenly and vanish just as quickly. Their longships could dart along coasts, slip up rivers, and disappear into the open sea before a defending army could arrive. It was a form of warfare alien to the slower, land-bound armies of Christendom. The Norse were not bound by castles or roads. Their highway was the ocean, their fortress the mobility of their ships. This new style of warfare reshaped the very idea of threat in Europe. For centuries, kingdoms had worried about invasions across land borders, from rival tribes, from neighboring states. Now, danger came from the sea, and it came with terrifying speed. No coastal town, no monastery, no river settlement could feel secure. The longship's prow was a constant reminder that safety was an illusion. Yet for the Vikings, these raids were not simply acts of destruction. They were opportunities for wealth and for the forging of identity. Each successful voyage created a ripple of influence back in Scandinavia. Warriors returned with silver arm rings, with weapons of foreign make, with slaves who would labor on their farms. Chieftains distributed treasure to their followers, strengthening their prestige and their claims to leadership. The social fabric of Scandinavia began to warp around this new source of power. Ambitious men found that raiding expeditions could elevate them above rivals. Leadership was measured not only in ancestry, but in the ability to command men across the sea, to return home with spoils that could be boasted of in feasts and carved into runestones. Fame, always a driving force in Norse culture, became ever more tied to voyages abroad. A man who had never raided might still be respected, but a man who had plundered the treasures of a Christian monastery was celebrated, his name carried in saga and song. The raiding life was dangerous, of course. Many never returned. Ships could be wrecked in storms, warriors slain in battle, expeditions failed. But for a society that believed in Valhalla, in glory beyond death, the risks only heightened the allure. To die with a sword in hand, far from home but in pursuit of honor, was not a tragedy, it was a fulfillment of destiny. Meanwhile, the raids exposed the Norse to cultures far different from their own. In Francia, they saw great stone churches, towns with bustling markets, and kings with armies of armored cavalry. In England, they encountered the written word, the Christian faith, and a tradition of monasteries filled with books and relics. Though the Vikings came first as raiders, they could not help but absorb what they saw. The very contact that began with fire and blood would, in time, bring change to Scandinavia itself. But in the late 8th and early 9th centuries, that change was still distant. For now, what mattered most was momentum. The Norse had discovered that Europe's wealth was within reach, and they were determined to seize it. The raids of the 790s were the spark. The raids of the early 800s would be the flame. Back home, the stories grew. Around the hearth fires of longhouses, men told of Lindisfarne, of Iona, of silver crosses and golden chalices seized from monks who had no warriors to defend them. Young men listened with wide eyes, their blood stirred by tales of glory. The next season, they too would take up oars and swords, eager to carve their own place in history. In this way, raiding became not just an activity, but a tradition, woven into the very identity of the Norse. Farmers who once measured success by the fertility of their fields, now measured it by voyages across the sea. Fathers urged sons to seek fortune abroad. Chieftains demanded loyalty with the promise of plunder. The Viking Age was not only a series of events, it was a cultural transformation, a reimagining of what it meant to be Norse. And at its root was the perfect alignment of technology, ambition, and opportunity. The longship gave them reach. The fractured politics of Europe gave them targets. The hunger for wealth and fame gave them purpose. The 8th century had set the stage, and now the play of the Viking Age was fully underway. By the end of the 8th century, the Norse world had changed forever. In less than a lifetime, Scandinavia had gone from a cluster of farming and fishing communities tied to their fjords and fields to a people whose sails were seen across the seas of Europe. The transformation was not absolute. Of course, most Norsemen still lived as farmers, tending their livestock, sowing their fields, and enduring the long winters. But above and beyond this daily life, a new current was pulling society outward. The age of raiding, trading, and seafaring had begun. The raids of the 790s and 800s were still small by the standards of later centuries. Fleets of 3, 5, or 10 ships struck monasteries and villages. Not yet the great armies that would one day march on Paris or carve out kingdoms in England. Yet their impact was enormous. They shook the Christian world, undermined its sense of safety, and planted in the Norse a confidence that nothing beyond the horizon was out of reach. For the Norse themselves, these early raids did more than bring treasure. They reshaped identity. A young man could now dream not only of farming his father's land, but of sailing to Britain or Francia, of returning with silver arm rings gleaming on his arms, of hearing his name praised in the hall as a bold raider. Ambition stretched across the sea. The longship was not merely a tool, it was a vessel of destiny. The spread of raiding also accelerated social change. Wealth from abroad enriched certain chieftains, giving them the power to attract larger followings. Authority in Scandinavia remained decentralized, but already the seeds of kingship were being sown. A leader who could command fleets, organize raids, and distribute loot could rise above rivals. In the next century, these patterns would help give birth to the first true Viking kings. Meanwhile, the exchange of goods and ideas deepened. Norse traders continued to carry furs, amber, and iron southward, returning with silver, glass, and fine cloth. The Abbasid dirhams that flowed into Scandinavia via eastern trade routes became the lifeblood of the economy. These coins were sometimes cut into pieces, turned into arm rings or jewelry, serving both as currency and as symbols of wealth. The influx of silver allowed chieftains to display their power more vividly than ever before. And yet, even as wealth grew, so too did tensions. The hunger for land and resources was not eased by raids alone. Scandinavia's rugged terrain could not support its growing population indefinitely. The raids were a release valve, but soon they would evolve into something greater. settlements, colonies, and permanent footholds abroad. But that, too, lay in the future. For now, as the 8th century ended and the 9th began, the Viking Age was in its infancy. Europe had felt the first blows of the Norse hammer, and the echoes of those strikes would resonate for centuries to come. The rise of the Viking Age was not a single moment, not even a single raid, but a process, a gathering storm that drew its strength from the convergence of technology, trade, ambition, and belief. The Norse believed that fate or word guided their lives. Yet fate, in their view, was not passive. It was shaped by deeds, by courage, by the willingness to seize opportunity. In this sense, the rise of the Viking Age was not inevitable, but it was born of a people ready to grasp what the horizon offered. They had the ships, they had the hunger, and they had the will. Europe, fractured and vulnerable, was unprepared for what was coming. The raids of 793 and the years that followed were but the prologue. The saga of the Viking Age was only beginning, and the decades to come would see Norse sails darken the seas from the British Isles to the Mediterranean, from the rivers of Russia to the shores of North America. The 8th century had ended in fire and blood. The 9th would blaze even brighter. And so, we have witnessed the rise of the Viking Age, the moment when the Norse broke free from their fjords and farms to become raiders, traders, and seafarers feared across Europe. From the invention of the longship to the infamous sack of Lindisfarne, the seeds of an age of exploration and conquest were planted in the century between 700 and 800 AD. But this is only the beginning. In our next episode, we follow the Vikings as they expand ever further westward into Ireland, into Francia, and deeper into England, where small raids become vast campaigns, and where settlement takes root in blood and ambition. If you've enjoyed this journey into the rise of the Viking Age, raise your metaphorical horn of mead in support. Leave a like, share this saga with fellow travelers, and subscribe to join us as we continue the epic story of the Norse. Your voice, like the songs of the Skalds, ensures these tales are carried far and wide. Until next time, may your sails be full, your shield strong, and your destiny bold.